On the 9th of February 1984, at 4:47 in the afternoon, the Soviet state issued a brief communiqué. Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, former Director of the KGB, was dead. The cause, as stated in the official medical bulletin signed by 6 of the country's most senior physicians, was kidney failure. The bulletin described a progressive deterioration of renal function over the course of approximately 1 year, culminating in complete failure despite sustained treatment via hemodialysis. It was clinical, it was precise, it was, on its face, entirely unremarkable for a 69-year-old man with a documented history of chronic nephritis. And yet, within hours of the announcement, something strange began circulating through the corridors of Moscow's academic institutions, through the hushed smoking rooms of party offices, and through the careful handwritten letters exchanged between people who had spent their careers learning to say nothing directly. The strangeness was not in the fact of Andropov's death. The strangeness was in the timing, in the numbers, in the dates that didn't quite add up when you placed them side by side and looked at them long enough. This is a story about dates, about the distance between what was written and what was true, about the machinery of a state that had perfected the art of institutional silence, and about the moments when that silence cracked just enough to let in a sliver of light. Let us begin with the document itself. Let's begin with The official medical conclusion stated that Andropov's condition had entered a critical phase in late January of 1984. This is the version that appeared in the Soviet press. This is the version that was transmitted to foreign governments. This is the version that historians trained in the West repeated for decades, because it was the only version that existed in any official capacity. But there was another version, a version that lived in the memories of men who had been in the room, in the diaries of advisors, who had written things down not because they planned to publish them, but because writing was the only way they knew how to think. And in that version, the critical deterioration did not begin in late January of 1984. It had begun 4 months earlier. 4 months? That is not a rounding error. That is not the kind of discrepancy that emerges from sloppy record-keeping or the fog of bureaucratic memory. 4 months is the distance between autumn and winter, between a man who's struggling and a man who's dying. The official bulletin had compressed that distance to almost nothing, had in effect erased the autumn entirely. Why would 6 senior physicians, men of science and professional reputation, sign their names to a document that was wrong by 4 months? This is the first question. It will not be the last. To understand what happened to Yuri Andropov, you must first understand what happened to his kidneys. And that story begins not in the winter of 1983, but more than a decade earlier, on the other side of the world. In 1969, Andropov traveled to Beijing as part of a Soviet diplomatic delegation navigating the catastrophically deteriorated relationship between Moscow and the Chinese Communist Party. The trip was tense in every dimension, politically, personally, diplomatically. What is less well known is that Andropov returned from that trip ill in a way that his doctors took seriously from the beginning. The precise nature of what happened in Beijing has never been fully documented in any source available to the public. What we know is what the physicians who treated him afterward recorded: that something had happened to his kidney function, that the damage was real, and that it was the kind of damage that does not simply repair itself over time. This was not a temporary illness. This was the beginning of a condition that would follow Andropov for the rest of his life. A slow, quiet erosion that accelerated during periods of stress, that retreated during periods of rest, but that never truly disappeared. Then came 1977. Andropov, by that point firmly established as the director of the KGB, made a trip to Afghanistan. The visit was not widely publicized. The geopolitical situation in that country was deteriorating in ways that Moscow found deeply alarming, and Andropov, whose instincts about the trajectory of Soviet foreign policy were among the sharpest in the entire Politburo, wanted to see the situation firsthand. He never made it past the tarmac. According to accounts that emerged years later from members of the security detail present on that day, Andropov descended from the aircraft, walked a short distance across the runway, and collapsed. He had to be assisted back up the stairs and returned to the plane. The episode was kept entirely out of official records. No mention appeared in any press organs, Soviet or foreign. The delegation carried on as though the incident had not occurred, but the men who were there remembered it. And what they remembered was not a man who had simply been caught by a moment of weakness. What they remembered was a man whose body was already, at 63 years old, beginning to send signals that it could not indefinitely continue to absorb what was being demanded of it. These two episodes, Beijing and Kabul, are not incidental biographical color. They are the architecture of what comes next. By the time Andropov was elevated to the position of General Secretary in November of 1982, following the death of Leonid Brezhnev, he was already a man managing a serious and chronic illness. His physicians knew this. The senior figures in the Politburo, or at least those with access to the classified health summaries that were prepared for the inner circle, almost certainly knew this. The Soviet public, of course, knew nothing. This information asymmetry is not incidental to the story. It is the story. Because what happened over the following months, the rapid, aggressive reforms that Andropov attempted to push through a system that had calcified under 18 years of Brezhnev's studied passivity, the anti-corruption campaigns that made powerful enemies with terrifying speed the bold signals about a different kind of Soviet future. All of this was happening inside a body that was running on borrowed time, managed by a medical system that was simultaneously treating a patient and serving a political function. The reforms were real, the enemies they created were real, and the question that investigators and historians would spend decades trying to answer, the question that Soviet citizens whispered to one another across kitchen tables and park benches and the back seats of official cars, was this. In a system where information about the health of the General Secretary was itself a state secret, who controlled that information? Who decided what the doctors reported and to whom? Who stood between the man and his medicine? The official version says Andropov died because his kidneys failed. But chronic kidney disease does not kill a man in a single season. It kills him over years, slowly, measurably, in stages that any competent nephrologist can track and document and, within limits, manage. Andropov had been living with damaged kidneys since 1969. He had been on hemodialysis, the machine that does the work the kidneys can no longer do, for months before his death. This was known. This was managed. This was, in the grim calculus of Soviet medicine, a situation that could be sustained. What the official version cannot adequately explain is the acceleration, the sudden dramatic compression of the timeline in those final months, the leap from managed chronic condition to complete systemic collapse that official documents describe as occurring in the span of a few weeks in January of 1984, when the evidence from Andropov's own inner circle, from diary entries and personal testimonies that would only become available after the collapse of the Soviet Union, places the beginning of the critical deterioration in September and October of 1983. 4 months that the official record simply chose not to count. And the reason those 4 months matter, the reason this particular gap between the official version and the documented reality is not merely a historical curiosity, but the opening of something much darker, is what happened in those 4 months, what Andropov was doing, where he was, who was responsible for his care, and what one of the most senior physicians in the Soviet Union did and did not do when the man he was sworn to protect became dangerously ill. That story begins in Crimea, on a bench in the forest, in the last warm days of a Soviet autumn that Yuri Andropov would not survive. The official version ends here. The real investigation is only beginning. There is a particular kind of silence that exists inside authoritarian systems. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of pressure. The silence of people who know things and have calculated with great precision the cost of saying them out loud. It is a silence that has weight, that has texture. That, if you know how to listen, is louder than almost anything else. In the autumn of 1983, that silence descended over the upper floors of the Central Clinical Hospital on Michurinsky Prospect in Moscow. The facility known simply as the TSKB, the exclusive medical institution that served the Soviet elite. It descended over the men who worked the night shifts, over the nurses who changed the linens, over the orderlies who wheeled the equipment, over the officers of the 9th Directorate of the KGB, the unit responsible for the physical protection of senior party leadership, who stood their posts in the corridors and pretended not to notice things that were very, very difficult not to notice. What they were not supposed to notice was that Yuri Andropov, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, the man who had spent 15 years as the most feared intelligence chief in the world, had been connected to a hemodialysis machine in a private ward of the TSKB weeks before the official record acknowledges that his condition had become critical. Weeks, not days. Weeks. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what hemodialysis is and what it means for a patient to be placed on it. Hemodialysis is not a precautionary measure. It is not something physicians recommend to patients who are simply having a difficult month. It is a decision made when the kidneys have lost the ability to perform their most essential function: filtering the blood, removing waste, maintaining the chemical balance that allows every other organ in the body to continue operating. When a patient is placed on dialysis, the medical team is acknowledging in the clearest possible clinical language that without mechanical intervention, that patient will die. Andropov was placed on dialysis in the autumn of 1983. The official medical bulletin, signed and published in February of 1984, described his deterioration as having begun in late January of that year. The diary of Anatoly Chernyaev, a senior official in the International Department of the Central Committee, a man whose meticulous personal journals would become one of the most valuable primary sources for understanding the inner workings of late Soviet politics, recorded the reality. Chernyaev wrote with the careful understatement of a man who understood that even private diaries could be read by the wrong people, that Andropov had been receiving dialysis treatment at the TSKB for some weeks before the events that the official narrative would later describe as the beginning of his final illness. The gap between these two accounts, the official bulletin and Chernyaev's diary, is not ambiguous. It is not a matter of interpretation. It is a factual discrepancy of approximately 4 months. And in the context of what followed, that discrepancy is not a footnote. It is the entire story. But history, particularly Soviet history, does not exist only in documents. It exists also in the stories that people tell when they have no documents, when the documents have been classified or shredded or never written in the first place. And in the months and years following Andropov's death, a particular story began to circulate through Moscow's informal networks, through the kitchens and the corridors and the cautious conversations between people who trusted one another just enough. The story involved a gun and a woman in a stairwell. Nikolai Shelikov had been the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Soviet Union for 16 years. He was a man of the Brezhnev era in every possible sense, appointed by Brezhnev, protected by Brezhnev, enriched under Brezhnev, and philosophically committed to the particular style of Soviet governance that Brezhnev represented: stable, tolerant of certain corruptions, deeply suspicious of reformers. When Andropov came to power and launched his anti-corruption campaign with the focused intensity of a man who knew exactly how much time he had and how much needed to change, Shelikov was one of the most prominent targets. His removal from office was swift and public. His subsequent fall was catastrophic. The investigation into his activities during the Brezhnev years uncovered a scale of personal enrichment that shocked even people who had assumed the worst. And then his wife died. And then he died. And in the space between those two events, in the grief and the rage and the desperation of a man who had watched everything he had built collapse around him, a story was born. The story said that Shelikov's wife, before her own death, had taken a weapon and waited for Andropov in the entrance of a building, that she had fired, that the bullet had struck him, that it had damaged his kidney, the kidney that was already compromised, already fragile, already operating at the edge of what was medically sustainable, and that this act of private vengeance had accelerated or perhaps even caused the final deterioration that killed him. It was a dramatic story. It had the internal logic that rumors require to survive: a wronged woman, a powerful enemy, a hidden wound, a death that needed an explanation more satisfying than bureaucratic medical failure. It spread with the particular velocity of narratives that feel emotionally true even when they are factually unsupported. And it was almost certainly not what happened. Here's why the story doesn't hold together, and why understanding its failure to hold together is just as important as understanding the story itself. Andropov was connected to the hemodialysis machine at the TSKB in the autumn of 1983. This is documented by Cherniev. This is corroborated by other sources who have since spoken or written about this period. The TSKB was not a public facility. It was not a place that a grieving widow, even the widow of a senior minister, even a woman with resources and connections and burning motivation, could simply walk into and access. The security apparatus surrounding the facility and surrounding Andropov personally was among the most elaborate in the Soviet system. More importantly, if the wound that the rumor described had existed, if Andropov had been shot, if he had sustained the kind of injury that the story required, there would have been physicians who knew about it, nurses who treated it. Records, however classified, that documented it. The circle of people with access to Andropov's medical situation was small, but it was not a circle of one. And in the decades since, as Soviet archives have partially opened, and as the people who were present in those rooms have aged and, in some cases, decided to speak, no credible account supporting the wound narrative has emerged. The bullet, in all probability, was never fired. The injury, as described in the rumor, almost certainly did not occur. And yet the rumor existed. It spread. It was believed, or half-believed, by people who were not naive, by educated Muscovites, by party officials, by people whose professional lives had given them reason to be skeptical of simple explanations. Why? Because the rumor was not really about a bullet. The rumor was about information, about the absence of information, about what happens to a population, even an educated, sophisticated, politically aware population, when the basic facts about the health of their head of government are classified as state secrets, when the official medical bulletins are written not to inform but to manage, when the gap between what is known inside certain rooms and what is known outside those rooms is so vast, so deliberately cultivated, that the space fills up with something: stories, rumors, narratives that make emotional sense even when they make no evidentiary sense. The story of Shelikov's wife and the gun in the stairwell is a document of Soviet information culture as much as it is a document of anything else. It tells us that ordinary people and extraordinary people understood on some instinctive level that the official version of events surrounding Andropov's death was incomplete, that there were things being hidden, that the carefully calibrated silence emanating from the TSKB and from the upper floors of the Central Committee was the silence of concealment, not the silence of nothing to conceal. They were right about the concealment. They were wrong, almost certainly, about the specific mechanism. The real mechanism was quieter than a gunshot. It was more institutional. It was built into the structure of the Soviet medical system and its relationship to Soviet political power in ways that were, in some respects, more troubling than any act of private violence could be. Andropov spent the autumn and early winter of 1983 in the TSKB, connected to machines, still receiving documents, still issuing instructions, still, in the most extraordinary act of political will, attempting to govern a country of over 270 million people from a hospital bed in a facility that officially did not acknowledge he was there. His staff brought him papers. He read them. He dictated responses. He signed things. The men around him watched. The physicians watched. The security officers watched. The Politburo members who came and went with the careful frequency of people calibrating their displays of concern against their calculations of what came next watched. And somewhere in those watching eyes, in the careful assessments being made by powerful men about the trajectory of Andropov's condition, about the timeline, about who would inherit what and when, the line between medical care and political management began to blur in ways that would only become fully visible years later when the people who had been in those rooms finally began, haltingly and partially and always, with certain things left unsaid to describe what they had seen. The official version said the critical deterioration began in January. Chernyayev's diary said otherwise. The official version said Andropov died of kidney failure, what the man responsible for his care would eventually admit in a different book, years after the first, when perhaps the weight of what he had written and not written had become difficult to carry, pointed towards something else entirely. That admission and what it means belongs to the next chapter of this investigation. But the question that Chernyayev's diary and the Shchelikov rumor together force us to ask, the question that sits at the center of everything that follows, is not simply what killed Yuri Andropov. It is who knew what and when, and what they chose to do with that knowledge, and what they chose to do with the man. There is a particular quality to the light in Crimea. In late summer, it arrives at an angle that makes everything look more permanent than it is. The white stone of the sanatoria, the dark green of the cypress trees, the long flat surface of the Black Sea catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in fragments. For decades, this peninsula had served as the private retreat of Soviet power. Khrushchev had governed from here. Brezhnev had spent entire months here, conducting the business of the world's largest state from a lounge chair on a terrace overlooking the water. Crimea was where Soviet leaders went when the weight of Moscow became too much, when the marble corridors and the armored cars and the permanent theater of power needed to be, at least temporarily, set aside. In the late summer of 1983, Yuri Andropov came to Crimea. He was not well. The people around him knew he was not well. His physicians knew with a precision that the public would not be permitted to understand for years exactly how unwell he was. And yet the trip was arranged, the security detail was assembled, the motorcade was prepared, and the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was brought to the peninsula that Soviet power had always used as its place of recovery. What happened next would become one of the most contested episodes in the entire account of Andropov's final months. It would be described officially as an accident, as bad luck, as the kind of thing that happens to older men with compromised immune systems who spend time outdoors in changeable weather. It would be described by others, by men who were present, by historians who examined the timeline afterward, by people who understood the biology of what was claimed to have occurred, as something that could not possibly be what the official account said it was. The official version of the Crimean episode belongs primarily to Yevgeny Chazov. Chazov was not an ordinary physician. He was the head of the fourth main directorate of the Soviet Ministry of Health, the department responsible for the medical care of the Soviet elite, a position that made him simultaneously one of the most powerful doctors in the country and one of the most politically embedded. He had treated Brezhnev through the long physical deterioration of the final years. He treated Andropov. He would go on to treat Chernenko and, in a different capacity, to serve as Minister of Health under Gorbachev. He was a man who understood with complete clarity that his professional function existed at the intersection of medicine and politics, and that navigating that intersection required a particular set of skills that had nothing to do with the Hippocratic Oath. In his memoirs, published in 1992, Chazov described the Crimean episode in terms that were almost studiedly unremarkable. Andropov, he wrote, had gone for a walk. He had sat on a granite bench in the forest near the sanatorium. The stone was cold, the air was cool, he had sat too long, become chilled, and the chill had progressed into a serious inflammatory condition. A phlegmon, meaning a diffuse bacterial infection spreading through the soft tissue beneath the skin, that required immediate surgical intervention when Andropov returned to Moscow. It was presented as misfortune, as the inevitable vulnerability of an aging man with a compromised immune system encountering an ordinary autumnal afternoon. The security officers who were present that day remembered it differently. The men of the 9th Directorate were professionals in the specific Soviet sense, which is to say they were professionals in observation, in discretion, and in the careful management of what they reported and to whom. They were not physicians, they were not historians. They were men whose entire professional existence consisted of being present in important moments and registering with the trained attention of people whose lives and careers depended on accuracy exactly what they saw. What they saw in Crimea was not a granite bench. Multiple accounts from members of the security detail present during Andropov's walks that autumn described the bench in question as wooden, not stone, not granite. Wood, and covered, moreover, with a blanket or plaid that had been placed there specifically to ensure the comfort of a man whose health was known to be fragile. This is not a trivial detail. The entire medical logic of Chazov's explanation depends on the cold of the stone surface. Remove the cold stone, replace it with a wooden bench covered in cloth, and the explanation dissolves. The chill that supposedly triggered the phlegmon did not occur in the way the official account described. Historian Valentin Ostrovsky, who spent years examining the documentary record of Andropov's final months and conducting interviews with surviving witnesses from this period, went further. He pointed to something that the Chazov account, for all its clinical detail, conspicuously failed to address: the basic biology of phlegmon development. A phlegmon, a spreading infection of the subcutaneous tissue, does not develop in an afternoon, does not develop in a day. The process of bacterial invasion, multiplication, and spreading to the degree that constitutes a clinically significant phlegmon requiring surgical intervention is a process that takes time, days at minimum, potentially longer depending on the organism involved, the location of the infection, and the immune status of the patient. The idea that Andropov sat on a cold surface on a particular afternoon and subsequently developed a serious phlegmon as a direct result of that single exposure is not consistent with how infections of this type actually develop. Which means, if Ostrovsky's analysis is correct, that Andropov was already ill before the walk, already harboring the infection, already deteriorating in a way that the walk did not cause but merely, at most, accelerated or complicated. And if Andropov was already ill before the walk, then Chazov knew it, because Chazov was his physician, because monitoring the health of the General Secretary was precisely and specifically his professional responsibility, because there was no scenario in the medical management of a patient as important and as carefully watched as Yuri Andropov in which a developing serious infection would go unnoticed by the team responsible for his care. Here is where the Crimean episode shifts from the register of medical history into something else, because on the day that Andropov went for the walk that Chazov would later describe as the triggering event of the final catastrophic deterioration, on that specific day, in that specific window of time, Chazov was not in Crimea. He had left. The head of the medical team responsible for the health of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the man whose professional life was organized entirely around the management of the health of Soviet leaders, had departed on a trip to the German Democratic Republic, a visit, a professional engagement, something that in the ordinary course of events would be entirely unremarkable. Senior Soviet physicians traveled, attended conferences, maintained relationships with their counterparts in fraternal socialist states. But this was not ordinary. Andropov was already on dialysis. Andropov was already fragile in ways that Chazov understood with complete clinical precision. The idea that a physician of Chazov's experience and political awareness would choose this particular moment to be absent, to be not merely unavailable, but in another country, requires some explanation. Chazov did not offer one, not in the 1992 memoir, not in the revised and expanded version he published in 2000, which, as Ostrovsky would note with considerable analytical precision, changed certain diagnostic details in ways that were difficult to attribute to simple memory revision. Between the first and second versions of his account, a diagnosis shifted. In 1992, Chazov described the Crimean condition as a phlegmon. In 2000, the same condition had become, in his telling, an abscess. These are not synonymous terms. They are not interchangeable descriptions of the same condition. They represent different pathological processes, different clinical presentations, different surgical approaches, and different implications for what the treating physician should have detected and when. Ostrovsky characterized this discrepancy not as the natural imprecision of aging memory, but as something more deliberate, a conscious adjustment designed to obscure the timeline and, with it, the question of when the condition first developed and who was responsible for monitoring it. The question of responsibility is the question that the Crimean episode ultimately forces into the open. Responsibility is a concept that Soviet medical culture handled in a very particular way. Within the Fourth Directorate, the elite medical apparatus that served the leadership, the hierarchy of obligation ran not simply from physician to patient, but from physician to system. The doctor's first duty was not in any straightforward sense to the individual in the bed. It was to the management of that individual's condition in a way that served the political requirements of the moment. Health information was political information. Medical decisions were political decisions. The line between treatment and management, between caring for a person and managing the narrative around a person, had never been clearly drawn, because in the Soviet context, drawing that line clearly would have been politically incoherent. Chazov understood this better than almost anyone. He had navigated it for years, through Brezhnev's decline, through the carefully managed public presentation of a man who was visibly, obviously, catastrophically unwell, but who remained in official communications merely under treatment for a minor ailment. He knew how to hold medical reality in one hand and political necessity in the other. The question that emerges from Crimea, from the wooden bench that was described as granite, from the infection that developed before the walk that supposedly caused it, from the absent physician who had left for East Germany, is whether what happened to Andropov in that Crimean autumn was the product of negligence or of something more considered. Negligence is a comfortable explanation. It distributes blame diffusely, suggests systemic failure rather than individual intent, and carries with it the implicit absolution of accident. Things went wrong. Nobody meant for this to happen. The system failed in the way that large, imperfect systems sometimes fail. But Ostrovsky, working from the documents available to him, from the testimony of witnesses, from the contradictions in Chazov's own successive accounts, arrived at a different framework, not negligence that produced a bad outcome, but decisions, specific, identifiable, individually made decisions that allowed a bad outcome to become catastrophic. Decisions about when to leave, about what to report, about which version of events to commit to paper, in what year, about what a physician who understood exactly what was happening chose to do and not do in those critical weeks. The walk in the forest, the bench in the afternoon light. The General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, aging and compromised and already carrying within his body an infection that no one was officially acknowledging, sitting in the Crimean autumn while the man responsible for his health flew west toward Berlin. It is possible that this was simply a terrible confluence of circumstances, that the timing was unfortunate, that the failures were failures of judgment and not of intention. It is also possible, and this is the possibility that the evidence examined carefully refuses to entirely foreclose, that the autumn of 1983 in Crimea was the moment when Andropov's fate was not merely allowed to unfold, but was, in some deliberate and deniable way, shaped. The surgery came on the 1st of October 1983 in Moscow. What the surgeons found and what Chazov eventually admitted about what killed Andropov. Not kidney failure, but something the official death certificate had carefully and deliberately not named. Belongs to the next chapter of this investigation, but the forest in Crimea will not leave the story. It sits in the middle of everything that follows, quiet and particular and unresolved. A walk, a bench, a man who was already dying faster than anyone was supposed to know, and a physician who was somewhere else. On the 1st of October 1983, Yuri Andropov was wheeled into an operating theater at the Central Clinical Hospital on Michurinsky Prospect. The procedure was described to those who needed to be told anything at all as a routine surgical intervention. Something minor, something managed. The kind of thing that happens and is resolved and does not need to occupy the attention of the Politburo or the Soviet press or the foreign intelligence services that were, at that precise moment, attempting to read the internal condition of the Soviet state through whatever fragments of information they could assemble. The word used in the immediate aftermath was phlegmon, a localized bacterial infection, serious certainly, serious enough to require surgery, but the kind of condition that medicine knows how to address, the kind of condition from which a patient recovers. The surgical team went in, addressed the infection, closed the wound, and the general secretary was returned to his ward. He never left that hospital again. To understand what the 1st of October actually represented, not in the language of official communiques, but in the language of clinical reality, you need to understand what was happening inside Andropov's body at the moment he was brought to the operating table. The infection that Chazov had described as originating in Crimea had not remained contained. This is the nature of bacterial infections in patients with compromised immune systems, patients on dialysis, patients whose bodies are already directing enormous physiological resources toward managing chronic systemic illness. The infection had spread, it had moved beyond the localized presentation that the word phlegmon implies, and had entered a different and far more dangerous phase, a phase in which bacteria and their toxic byproducts are no longer confined to a specific tissue site but have entered the bloodstream itself. This condition has a name. The name is sepsis. Sepsis is not a complication of infection in the way that a sprained ankle is a complication of a fall. It is a systemic crisis, a state in which the body's response to bacterial invasion becomes so widespread and so dysregulated that it begins to damage the body's own organs, the kidneys, the liver, the lungs, the cardiovascular system. In a patient who's already on dialysis, already dependent on mechanical support for renal function, already operating with physiological reserves that have been depleted by months of chronic illness, sepsis is not a manageable setback. It is a catastrophic cascade. The surgical team on the 1st of October was not, in any realistic sense, treating a phlegmon. They were encountering the evidence of a process that had already progressed far beyond what that word described. Whether they fully communicated this to the relevant authorities, to the Politburo members who needed to understand the actual trajectory of the General Secretary's condition, to the security apparatus responsible for continuity of governance, to anyone outside the immediate medical circle, is a question that the documentary record answers only partially, and in certain respects, not at all. What makes the October surgery the documentary fulcrum of this entire investigation is not what happened in the operating theater. It is what Chazov wrote about it afterward, and more precisely the difference between what he wrote in one decade and what he wrote in another. In 1992, Chazov published his memoirs. The book was a significant document, the personal account of the man who had been at the center of Soviet elite medical care for decades, written in the relative freedom of the post-Soviet moment, when certain things could be said that could not have been said before. It was read carefully by historians, by former party officials, by journalists who had spent years trying to reconstruct what had actually happened inside the closed medical world of the Soviet leadership. In that 1992 account, Chazov described the condition treated on the 1st of October as a phlegmon. He described the surgical intervention as having addressed that condition. He described Andropov's subsequent deterioration in terms that kept the kidney failure narrative, the official narrative, the narrative of the death certificate, essentially intact. In 2000, Chazov published a revised and expanded version of his account. He was older. The Soviet Union had been gone for nearly a decade. The political consequences of precise disclosure had shifted in ways that might conceivably have made honesty marginally less costly. And in that second version, the diagnosis had changed, not dramatically, not with any accompanying acknowledgement that the first version had been imprecise. But the condition treated on the 1st of October was now described in the 2000 account not as a phlegmon, but as an abscess. Ostrovsky, examining these two accounts side by side with the methodical attention of a historian trained to treat textual inconsistency as evidence, was direct about what this discrepancy represented. A phlegmon and an abscess are not the same thing. A phlegmon is a diffuse spreading infection. It has no defined boundary, no capsule, no wall separating the infected tissue from the surrounding healthy tissue. An abscess is a contained collection of infected material surrounded by a defined wall of tissue. The surgical approach is different. The clinical presentation is different. The implications for how and when the infection developed and how and when a competent physician should have detected it are different in ways that matter enormously to the question of medical responsibility. You do not misremember over the course of 8 years whether the condition you treated was diffuse or contained. These are not interchangeable descriptions of a vague general impression. They are precise clinical terms that describe fundamentally different pathological entities. A physician of Chazov's experience and intelligence does not confuse them in his first account and then silently correct himself in his second without explanation. Ostrovsky's conclusion was measured but unmistakable. The change between the two accounts was not a correction of an innocent error. It was an adjustment, a deliberate revision designed to shift the clinical picture in ways that affected the larger question of what was known, when it was known, and who was responsible for what was or was not done about it. But the most significant admission in Chazov's evolving account was not the shift from phlegmon to abscess. It was what he eventually acknowledged about the cause of death. The official medical bulletin of the 9th of February 1984 stated that Andropov died of kidney failure, specifically of chronic renal insufficiency progressing to complete renal failure despite sustained hemodialysis treatment. This was the document signed by 6 senior physicians and transmitted to the Soviet public, to foreign governments, and to the historical record. It was the document that established the official narrative that would be repeated in encyclopedias and textbooks and Wikipedia entries for decades. Kidney failure. The kidneys stopped working. A man with a long history of renal disease finally lost the battle that had been ongoing since Beijing in 1969. Chazov, in his later account, said something different, not loudly, not with the drama that the revelation arguably deserved, but clearly enough in the careful language of a physician describing a clinical sequence that the meaning was not ambiguous to anyone reading with attention. Andropov, Chazov acknowledged, died of sepsis. Sepsis, the systemic infection, the bacterial invasion of the bloodstream, the cascading organ failure that follows when an infection that should have been contained and treated is instead allowed to progress to a point of no return. Not kidney failure in the sense that the official bulletin described, not the slow terminal decline of chronically damaged organs reaching their final limit, but the acute, aggressive, systemic crisis of a body overwhelmed by infection. These are not the same cause of death. They are not interchangeable descriptions of the same process. Kidney failure, in the context of Andropov's documented medical history, was expected. It was the anticipated end of a long decline. It implied that everything that could be done had been done, and that the underlying disease had simply, finally, won. Sepsis implied something else entirely. Sepsis implied an acute event, an infection that developed and was not adequately treated, or was treated too late, or was treated in a context where other decisions had been made that compromised the possibility of effective treatment. Sepsis, in a patient already on dialysis and already immunocompromised, was not an inevitable outcome of chronic kidney disease. It was the outcome of what happened in Crimea, and in the operating theater on the 1st of October, and in the weeks that followed. The official death certificate, signed by 6 physicians, including Chazov himself, said kidney failure. Chazov's own later account said sepsis. One of these documents was false. It bore 6 signatures and the imprimatur of the Soviet medical establishment, and it was the document that entered the historical record as the official account of how the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union died. The falsification of a cause of death on an official medical document is not, in most legal systems, a minor administrative irregularity. It is a serious act, one that carries with it implications not merely for the historical record, but for the question of accountability, of what was concealed and why, of who benefited from the concealment. In the Soviet context, of course, the concept of legal accountability for such an act was essentially theoretical. There was no institution to which one could bring the complaint. There was no prosecutor who would take the case. There was no court that would hear it. The Soviet state was, in a very literal sense, both the potential perpetrator of the concealment and the only institution with the authority to investigate it. The circularity was not accidental, it was structural. But the falsification of the death certificate was not merely a bureaucratic act. It was a statement made by 6 physicians under the authority of the Soviet medical establishment at the direction of forces that the document itself does not name, about what the Soviet leadership wanted the world to believe about how its general secretary had died. And the distance between that statement and what Chazov's own later account acknowledged, between kidney failure and sepsis, between the inevitable and the preventable, between natural death and the outcome of decisions made and not made, is the distance between a story that closes questions and a story that opens them. Sepsis does not arrive without warning. It announces itself through the body's own responses, through fever and elevated inflammatory markers, and the clinical signs that any competent physician monitoring a high-risk patient is specifically trained to detect and respond to. In a patient under the level of medical surveillance that Andropov was theoretically receiving, in a facility designed specifically for the care of the Soviet elite, staffed by the most qualified physicians in the country, operating with resources unavailable to any ordinary Soviet hospital, sepsis should not have been allowed to progress to the point of irreversibility. It was, and the man who knew this best, who had been present through the entire sequence, who had made the decisions about when to be in Crimea and when to be in East Germany, who had written one version of events in 1992 and a quietly different version in 2000, signed his name to a document that said something else. The signature on the death certificate is not just a name. It is the endpoint of a chain of decisions, medical, political, institutional, that began in a forest in Crimea and ended in a ward at the TSKB on a February afternoon. What happened in between those 2 points, in the corridors and the meeting rooms, and the private conversations that left no official record, is the territory of the next chapter. Because it was not only physicians who knew that something had gone wrong, others knew too, and some of them, in the closed world of Soviet institutional power, tried to do something about it. There is a specific moment in the life of any institution, any organization built on hierarchy and secrecy, and the careful management of information, when the thing it was designed to prevent begins to happen from the inside, when the machinery turns not against external enemies, but against its own. When the men who built the walls discover that the walls have enclosed them too, that the rules they enforced on others apply to them with equal and merciless precision, and that the system they served will not, in the end, serve them back. For the KGB, that moment came in the autumn and winter of 1983. The men of the 9th Directorate, the protection detail, the officers who stood in corridors and rode in motorcades, and knew with the intimate knowledge of people who are always present and never acknowledged exactly what was happening to the man they were assigned to protect, had been watching Andropov deteriorate for months. They had seen what happened in Crimea. They had been there. They had seen the bench and the blanket and the afternoon light and the walk that Chazov would later describe in terms that did not match what they had witnessed. They had watched the General Secretary return from that walk already ill in a way that suggested the walk had not caused it. They had stood in the corridors of the TSKB and listened to the particular silence of a facility where the most important patient in the country was connected to machines, and the information flowing outward from those rooms was being carefully, professionally managed. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of what they had seen, something shifted. A threshold was crossed. The professional training that instructed them to observe and report and say nothing beyond the appropriate channels came into conflict with something older and more fundamental. The sense that what was happening was wrong, that the man they were protecting was not being protected, that the system supposedly organized around his survival was operating in some way that they could not fully articulate but could not dismiss against it. They decided to write a letter. The letter was addressed to Viktor Chebrikov. Chebrikov had assumed the chairmanship of the KGB in December of 1982, appointed by Andropov himself shortly after taking power. He was, in the most direct possible sense, Andropov's man, elevated to the leadership of the most powerful security apparatus in the Soviet state by the very person whose health the letter was now asking him to address. The logic of writing to Chebrikov was sound. If anyone in the Soviet institutional structure had both the authority and the motivation to intervene in the medical situation surrounding Andropov, it was the man who led the KGB, who owed his position to Andropov, and who commanded the resources to investigate and act on concerns that could not be raised through ordinary channels. The letter, as reconstructed from accounts that emerged years later, described the concerns of the officers directly. It stated that the men responsible for the physical protection of the General Secretary had observed irregularities in the management of his care, in the handling of his condition, in the decisions made by the medical personnel responsible for his treatment. That suggested his deterioration was not proceeding in the way that natural illness alone could account for. It asked Chebrikov to use the authority of the KGB to examine what was happening and to intervene if intervention was warranted. It was a remarkable document, not because of what it accused. The language was careful, institutional, the language of men trained to communicate through official channels, even when what they were communicating was explosive. But because of what it represented, officers of the KGB formally requesting that their own organization investigate the possibility that the man at the apex of Soviet powers was being inadequately protected, or worse, by the people responsible for his care. In a different system, in a system where institutional accountability meant what the words implied, such a letter would have triggered a formal investigation. It would have been logged, assigned, escalated. It would have produced interviews and document reviews and the kind of procedural response that leaves a paper trail. Chebrikov destroyed it. This is not inference. This is not the conclusion reached by working backward from circumstantial evidence. This is according to accounts that survive from individuals with direct knowledge of what happened, what Chebrikov did with the letter from the protection officers. He received it, he read it, or was briefed on its contents, and he destroyed it, physically, deliberately, and instructed the men involved to say nothing further about the matter. Ostrovsky, who documented this episode with the care of a historian who understands that unverifiable claims require corroboration, was precise in his characterization of what Chebrikov's action represented. It was not, he argued, the act of a man who had read the letter, assessed it as unfounded, and concluded that no action was warranted. That conclusion, even if reached, would not require destruction. Documents assessed as unfounded are filed. They are noted and set aside. They are not eliminated. Destruction implies a different calculation. Destruction implies that the document posed a risk, not to Andropov, whose protection was theoretically the purpose of the entire apparatus, but to something else, to someone else, to a situation that the destruction of the letter was designed to preserve rather than disturb. Ostrovsky used specific language about this. He described Chebrakov's action as a dereliction of official duty, a failure to perform the function that his position explicitly required of him when credible concerns about the safety of a protected person were brought to his attention through official channels. And he went further. He described what had occurred taken as a whole. The destruction of the letter, the instruction to maintain silence, the subsequent events that the letter had anticipated and that Chebrakov's inaction had done nothing to prevent, as a criminal conspiracy between Chebrakov and Chazov. These are not casual words from a historian given to overstatement. Criminal conspiracy in this context means a deliberate agreement between two or more parties, each acting within their own sphere of institutional authority, to allow a specific outcome to occur by ensuring that the mechanisms that might have prevented it were neutralized. Chebrakov neutralized the letter. Chazov managed the medical narrative. Between them, they controlled the two channels through which the truth about what was happening to Andropov might have reached someone with both the knowledge and the power to intervene. But to understand why these two men made the choices they made, you need to understand the political atmosphere of the TSKB in the autumn and winter of 1983. The texture of the conversations happening in its corridors and its offices, the calculations being made by powerful people about what came next. Andropov had enemies. This is not a conspiratorial assertion. It is a political fact of the most straightforward kind. His anti-corruption campaign had moved faster and struck harder than anything the Soviet system had seen in decades. He had removed Chelikov. He had begun investigations into networks of patronage and enrichment that reached deep into the party apparatus, into the military, into the regional structures that ran the vast Soviet periphery. He had made it clear through action rather than merely through speech that the Brezhnev-era tolerance for institutional corruption was over. The people threatened by this campaign were not minor figures. They were men with decades of accumulated power, with connections that ran horizontally across the entire Soviet institutional landscape, with the kind of influence that does not simply evaporate when a new general secretary issues a directive. They were men who understood that their survival, professional, financial, and in some cases more fundamentally personal, depended on the removal of the pressure Andropov represented. In the closed world of the Soviet elite, where information about the general secretary's health was a commodity of extraordinary political value, the knowledge that Andropov was seriously ill, knowledge that was circulating in carefully managed fragments among the inner circle, was not neutral information. It was a signal, a starting gun, the beginning of the process by which the men who would inherit the system began to position themselves, to make alliances, to calculate how to ensure that what came after Andropov was something they could live with. Into this atmosphere, the letter from the protection officers landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples it created were not the ripple of investigation and accountability. They were the ripples of institutional self-protection, of powerful men recognizing a threat and moving with the practiced efficiency of people who have spent their careers navigating exactly this kind of moment to contain it. There is another dimension to the conspiracy of silence that Ostrovsky documented, and it concerns not the powerful men at the top of the institutional hierarchy, but the man at the center of it, Andropov himself. Because Andropov knew not everything, not the full architecture of what was being managed around him, but he knew enough. He had spent 15 years running the KGB. He had built his career on the precise and professional management of information, on the cultivation of sources inside every institution that mattered, on the understanding that in Soviet politics, what people said officially and what was actually happening were separated by a distance that only the most sophisticated could accurately measure. He knew his own body. He knew his own physicians. He knew, with the intuition of an intelligence professional who had spent decades reading people and situations, that the information being given to him about his own condition was being filtered, managed, shaped. And at some point in those long months in the TSKB connected to machines, reading the hundreds of pages that his staff brought him daily, signing the documents that kept the government nominally functioning, he began to receive other information, informal, indirect, the kind of information that reaches a man through the loyalty of individuals who cannot officially report what they know but find ways to communicate it anyway. One of his aides, a man whose access to Andropov gave him both the opportunity and the obligation to convey what was being whispered, brought him the rumors, not the Shchelikov story, something more specific, more institutional, more consistent with the kind of threat that a former intelligence chief would recognize, the suggestion that his illness was not proceeding entirely according to natural law, that decisions were being made in the spaces around him that were not being made in his interest, that the campaign against corruption had created enemies who were, in the language of the system he had spent his life serving, taking action. Andropov listened. He was a man who had spent his life processing information in exactly this register, assessing its reliability, tracing its provenance, calculating what it meant and what it implied, what he concluded, what he decided to do with what he had heard, what instructions, if any, he gave, has not been fully documented in any source that has become publicly available. What we know is that the letter was written, that it reached Chebrikov, that Chebrikov destroyed it, that Chazov continued to manage the narrative that the silence held. The conspiracy of silence that Ostrovsky described was not, in the end, a conspiracy of the dramatic kind, not a secret meeting in a paneled room where men in dark suits agreed on a plan and shook hands over it. Soviet institutional conspiracies rarely worked that way. They worked through the accumulation of individual decisions, each of which could be justified on its own terms, each of which fit within the normal operational parameters of the institution from which it originated, but which together produced an outcome that none of the individual decisions examined in isolation could fully account for. Chebrikov destroyed a letter. This was within his authority as chairman of the KGB. He could characterize it as a judgment call about the credibility of the report. Chazov managed the medical narrative. This was within the operational culture of the 4th Directorate, which had always managed medical information as political information. Each man, asked individually to account for his actions, could point to precedent, could point to the normal functioning of his institution, could argue with considerable technical accuracy that what he had done was consistent with how things had always been done. But the man in the ward at the TSKB, connected to his machines, reading his hundreds of pages, having his pages turned for him because his hands were no longer reliably strong, that man was dying in a way that the institutions around him had been designed to prevent and had, through the accumulation of those individually justifiable decisions, chosen not to. The silence that descended over Michurinsky Prospect in those final months was not the silence of nothing to say. It was the silence of everything that had been decided not to be said, held in place by two men operating in two different institutional spheres who had calculated that the truth was more dangerous than the alternative. What happened in the first days of February 1984, in the final hours of Andropov's life, in the movements of the men who came to his ward, not as physicians or as protectors, but as successors, is the last chapter of this story. And it is the chapter in which the silence finally, irrevocably, became irreversible. In the last weeks of his life, Yuri Andropov read approximately 400 pages a day. This is not a metaphor. This is not a symbolic detail inserted for dramatic effect. This is what the men who were present in his ward at the Central Clinical Hospital reported with the specificity of people describing something they had witnessed and found extraordinary. Extraordinary not because the number was large, though it was, but because of the circumstances under which the reading was happening. Andropov was connected to a hemodialysis machine. His body was managing a systemic infection that his official medical record would not acknowledge for months after his death. His hands, by the final weeks, had lost enough strength and coordination that turning the pages of a document had become difficult. So his security officers turned the pages for him. They stood beside the bed of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and turned the pages of state documents, intelligence reports, policy briefs, and correspondence while he read, while he annotated, while he dictated responses and instructions to the aides who came and went through the ward with the carefully managed regularity of a system trying to project normalcy onto a situation that was anything but normal. He was governing a country from a hospital bed. He was governing it through machines and through the hands of his security detail and through the careful choreography of men who understood that the moment the outside world fully grasped what was happening in that ward, something irreversible would begin. He was doing this not because he did not know he was dying, he almost certainly did, but because stopping meant something specific in the Soviet system. Stopping meant the question of succession became open, and an open succession question in the Soviet Union of 1983 was not an administrative matter. It was a political event with consequences that would reach far beyond the ward on Meticulously Prospect. So he read 400 pages a day, and his guards turned the pages. Outside the ward, the calculations had already begun. This is the part of the story that the Soviet system was, in a certain sense, most perfectly designed to produce. The part where the institutional machinery of succession begins to operate, while the man being succeeded is still alive. Where the future is being negotiated in the present, in the quiet conversations and the careful visits, and the subtle repositioning of alliances that happens when powerful people understand that a transition is coming, and understand equally that the transition will reward those who prepared for it and penalize those who did not. The men who came to visit Andropov in those final weeks came with the particular attentiveness of people who are simultaneously paying their respects and taking inventory, who sat at his bedside and spoke about state matters while noting with the precision of experienced political observers how he looked, how he spoke, how his hands moved, how long he could sustain a conversation before the effort became visible in his face, who left the ward and walked to their cars and their offices carrying assessments that they did not commit to paper, but that informed every subsequent conversation they had. Mikhail Gorbachev came. He was by this point one of the most prominent figures in the upper echelons of the party. Younger than the others, more vigorous, associated with the reformist energy that Andropov had brought to the General Secretaryship, and that Andropov had in various ways signaled as the direction in which he wanted the Soviet system to move. Gorbachev had been, in the language of Soviet political observation, Andropov's man, the figure most clearly positioned to carry forward whatever Andropov had started. And yet what Gorbachev did and did not do in those final weeks, and in the days immediately following Andropov's death, would itself become a small but telling document in the larger story of what the Soviet political elite made of what had happened to their General Secretary. But that comes later. First, there is the 6th of February. On the 6th of February, 1984, a meeting took place. It was small. It was not a full Politburo session. It was the kind of meeting that happens in systems where the most consequential decisions are made before they are officially made, where the formalities of collective decision-making are preceded by the real decision, arrived at in a room small enough that everyone present understands their role and the outcome is not in doubt. Andropov was still alive on the 6th of February. He was alive. He was connected to his machines. And he was, by most accounts, still intermittently conscious and capable of understanding what was happening around him. At that meeting, the decision was made to transfer power to Konstantin Chernenko, not after Andropov's death, before it, 3 days before the official announcement that he had died. The men who controlled the Soviet system had already determined who would lead it next, had already, in effect, closed the question that Andropov's survival had kept technically open. Had decided in that small room on the 6th of February that the transition was complete, that whatever remained of the man in the ward on Meticulously Prospect was not relevant to the political future that had just been agreed upon. Chernenko was 72 years old. He was visibly unwell in a way that made his elevation to the general secretaryship one of the more remarkable acts of institutional self-preservation in Soviet political history. The selection by a system apparently committed to gerontocracy, even at the cost of coherence, of a man who would be dead himself within 13 months. He was, in the most precise sense, the anti-Andropov, a Brezhnev loyalist, a man of the old system, the embodiment of everything that Andropov's 15 months in power had been directed against. His selection on the 6th of February, 3 days before Andropov's official death, was the political system's definitive answer to the question that Andropov's entire tenure had posed. On the 9th of February, Chernenko came to the ward. He did not come alone. He came with Georgy Plekhanov, the head of the 9th Directorate, the very directorate whose officers had written the letter that Chebrikov had destroyed. The man responsible for Andropov's physical protection came to the ward on the day of his death in the company of the man who had just been designated as his successor. They took the keys. This detail, documented by Alexander Korzakov, who was present as a security officer and who would later become famous as Boris Yeltsin's bodyguard and confidant before publishing his own account of the things he had seen across decades of proximity to Soviet and Russian power, is the kind of detail that history sometimes preserves not because anyone planned to preserve it, but because there happened to be a witness whose memory held it and whose subsequent position gave him both the ability and eventually the inclination to record it. Chernenko and Plekhanov came to the ward. They took the keys to the safe containing the classified documents that Andropov had been working from in his final weeks. The intelligence materials, the state correspondence, the sensitive briefings that constituted the working archive of the General Secretary. They took those keys from a man who was still technically alive, and then the life support systems were disconnected. Korzakov's account of this moment is the closest thing that exists to a direct witness testimony of what happened in that ward on the 9th of February, 1984. It is not a neutral account. Korzakov was a man with his own perspectives, his own allegiances, his own reasons for choosing what to record and how to frame it. But it is specific, it is detailed in the way that genuine memory is detailed and fabricated. Accounts often are not. And it describes, without euphemism, the sequence, the arrival, the removal of the keys, the disconnection of the equipment that had been keeping Yuri Andropov alive. Ostrovsky, examining this account against the timeline and the medical record and the political sequence of those days, used a specific word for what occurred: euthanasia, not murder in the conventional sense, not the dramatic act of personal violence that the Shkelokov rumor had imagined. Something quieter, more institutional, more consistent with the way the Soviet system actually operated. A decision made by the appropriate people in the appropriate room with the appropriate authority to end a life that had already been politically superseded, to close in the most literal possible sense the chapter that the 6th of February had already officially closed. The machines were switched off. At 4:47 in the afternoon, Yuri Andropov was declared dead. The official cause, signed by 6 physicians, including the man who would later, in a different book, acknowledge that the real cause was something different: kidney failure. In the days that followed, something else happened that Ostrovsky noted and that the historical record confirms. Nobody came to the memorial. This requires explanation because in the Soviet political culture of 1984, attendance at the official ceremonies surrounding the death of a general secretary was not optional. It was not a matter of personal grief or individual preference. It was a political obligation of the most binding kind, and the kind enforced not by law, but by the understanding that absence would be noted, would be interpreted, and would carry consequences. Senior party officials attended these ceremonies because not attending was a statement, and statements of that kind in Soviet political culture had costs. Gorbachev did not attend the memorial service. Neither did the other Politburo members who had been most closely associated with Andropov. who had been, in the political language of the moment, his people. They did not come. They sent formal communications of condolence through the appropriate channels. They fulfilled the minimum requirements of institutional acknowledgement, but they were not there. What does an absence mean? In ordinary life, perhaps nothing. In Soviet political culture in 1984, following the death of a general secretary under circumstances that the people closest to the situation understood, even if they could not say so openly, to be something other than natural, an absence is a document. It is a statement made in the language of not being there, a communication sent through the medium of an empty chair at a ceremony that everyone was expected to attend. It said, "We know." We cannot say we know, but we know. Yuri Andropov served as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union for 444 days. In that time, he initiated an anti-corruption campaign of a scale and speed that the Soviet system had not seen in a generation. He promoted younger officials, Gorbachev among them, who would go on to reshape the Soviet state in ways that neither they nor anyone else fully anticipated. He signaled, through action and through the choices of personnel and emphasis that define any leader's tenure, a direction toward accountability, toward efficiency, toward the recognition that the system as it had functioned under Brezhnev could not continue indefinitely without consequence. He was succeeded by a man who undid most of what he had started, who was himself dead within 13 months, who served as little more than a parenthesis in the larger story of Soviet decline. And then came Gorbachev. Whether the Soviet Union would have ended differently, whether the specific path of collapse and transformation that unfolded between 1985 and 1991 would have been the same or different or avoided entirely. Had Andropov lived, had the Crimean autumn gone otherwise, had the letter been investigated rather than destroyed, had the machines not been switched off on a February afternoon by men who had already decided what came next. These are questions that history does not answer. They belong to the category of the irreversible, events that happen that cannot be unhappened, whose alternatives exist only as speculation. What is not speculation is the document, the death certificate that said kidney failure, and the physician's later account that said sepsis, the diary entry that said autumn, and the official bulletin that said January, the wooden bench that the official account called granite, the letter that was destroyed, the keys that were taken, the machines that were switched off. These things happened. They are recorded, not in the official record, which was written by the system for the system's purposes, but in the spaces around the official record, in diaries and memoirs, and the memories of men who turned pages for a dying leader and stood in corridors and watched things they were not supposed to see, in the contradictions between one book published in one decade and another published in the next, in the absences at a memorial that everyone was supposed to attend. The Soviet state was very good at silence, at the management of information, at the construction of official versions that held together well enough for long enough to serve their purpose. But silence has a structure, and if you know where to look, at the joints, at the places where one account meets another and does not quite align, at the dates that don't match and the words that change between one telling and the next, the structure becomes visible. And what it reveals in the case of Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov is not the story of a man who died because his kidneys failed. It is the story of a system that consumed one of its own, slowly, institutionally, with the full apparatus of medical science and political authority and official silence deployed, not to save him, but to manage his disappearance in a way that served the interests of the men who came after. 444 days. A granite bench that was wooden, a death certificate that lied. Keys taken from a living man, the file is closed, the questions are not.